Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. You may know me from the Wayback History channel here on YouTube and the Apolitical World Map Project. This is a new venture called Wayback History Reactions. On this channel, I'll lend my analysis to add context to videos by other creators on this and other platforms. While I have no professional degree in this field, history and geopolitics has been a lifelong passion, and I can't wait to learn both with and from all of you, as well as the original creators. We're going to start with one that should generate plenty of conversation as we react to Brandon F's video, Is This Film Racist? The Patriot Review Part 1, Slavery and Race Relations in Colonial America. I'm familiar to an extent with Brandon's background as a historical reenactor, and I've seen several of his videos on historical and geopolitical topics that haven't received enough attention elsewhere, most recently his video on the Siege of Tsingtao in World War I, which was excellent, by the way. Now, ordinarily, I'd like to react to videos I haven't yet seen in the mold of Chris from Vlogging Through History, who's one of the main inspirations for this channel and who I'm a proud Patreon supporter of. But in this case, I want to be upfront that I have previously seen this video and thought it would be a great first reaction. The original video is roughly an hour, so we'll split this into multiple parts. This is part 1. Look for part 2 in the coming days. With that, let's dive into Brandon F's Is This Film Racist? Mel Gibson's The Patriot.
Of those criticisms which I received in my first video introducing this series, I would say that the most common, and indeed the most understandable and agreeable criticism, was that despite my arguments against such, I was taking it all a little bit too seriously. That despite being very inaccurate, The Patriot could still be viewed as a popcorn movie of sorts. Ignore the history, and all you have is a fun action-adventure, a Mel Gibson, America F yeah, beat 'em up, or rather, mutilate them up, kind of film. The fact that
And that, of course, placing it alongside something like Braveheart, sort of an American War of Independence version of Braveheart, film that The Patriot has often been compared to. So that's sort of where he's coming from on that.
battles or the uniforms are wrong is kind of besides the point. Just don't take it all so seriously. And well, if those were the sorts of inaccuracies that I meant when I said that this film was a genuine insult, then yes, that would be a fair enough point. But those are hardly the worst problems with this film. Indeed, even the one-sided wartime narrative that's told in this film is not, in my opinion, the worst aspect of it. There lies within this movie a much more deeply rooted and disturbing element that puts even the infamous church burning scene to shame. A kind of disgusting revisionism, the likes of which continues to adversely affect not only the historical record, but the lives of Americans today. I'm talking here about how The Patriot portrays race relations in the 18th century American South. Now, to some this may sound stereotypical. It may sound overly dramatic, unnecessarily hostile. Particularly, of course, in a day and age when so-called identity politics has become so common and controversial in American political dialogue. Now, I'm not the kind of person to cry out a word like racism very readily, nor do I seek out racially based problems or arguments in politics and life. But when such a significant and a horrific thing like slavery is portrayed as it is in this film, it's impossible to not notice it and to call it out, if you will. I feel it's unnecessary to defend a statement that the condition of the African slave in the American southern colonies during this time period was horrible. Perhaps not quite so bad as those in the Caribbean harvesting sugar, or quite so bad as in much later years, say just before the American Civil War, but they were
Okay, so for context there, the southern American colonies were essentially formed as an extension of the British colonies in the Caribbean, which, of course, remember, the European powers had been competing in the Caribbean for, by the time of the American War of Independence, about 300 years, going back to the late 15th, early 16th century. So the American mainland plantation colonies were kind of an offshoot of the colonies in the Caribbean, mainly which were harvesting sugar. Sugar is one of the most labor-intensive and brutal crops to harvest. So, yeah, to his point, the American colonies, most of which were originally formed for rice, then, of course, tobacco came in, and as you got into the Deep South Later on, there were other things, but at this point, it was mainly just the coastal colonies. In fact, it was only the coastal colonies. Inland of that was Spanish territory. But the coastal colonies there, the Carolinas, for example, and of course Virginia, formed on rice and the latter tobacco farming, was by nature less brutal than sugar harvesting in the Caribbean. And of course, around this time, just after the American War of Independence, about 3 decades after, you have the slave revolt in Haiti against the French. So things were definitely worse down in the Caribbean. And yes, they definitely did get worse in the Americas, as the decades went on.
Terrible all the same. It saw brutal punishments, terrible working and living conditions, and of course a complete lack of agency over one's own life, as these men and women were considered mere property to their overlords. Even the most mundane moments of their lives represented an irreversible psychological harm, on the subject of which I would recommend a video by Mr. Aton Shea Films, titled simply The Mundane Horror of American Slavery, if you'd like to learn more about exactly what I mean when I say that.
Okay, so one of the things that I liked about Chris from Vlogging Through History, again, his reaction to Aton Shea Films' content over the years, important to note, again, where people are coming from. And as we explore different topics on this channel, I'm sure you'll get kind of more of a sense of, where I'm coming from, because everybody's own worldview and their life experiences, etc., kind of inform where they're coming from on various issues. And it has been pointed out that Aton Shea, when it comes to issues involving the Confederacy or slavery, he does have a bit of a zeal of the converted because of his background as somebody who grew up being taught the lost cause of the Confederacy, learning that as a kid, then moving to Massachusetts. That whole background that he has sort of given him a zeal of the converted when it comes to that issue. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just gives us a little more context of where Aton Shea is coming from on his analysis. When it comes to Brandon F. and the Patriot, he referenced at the beginning of this video his part 0 of his Patriot reaction. And I did watch that. In that video, Brandon F., it's not necessarily a zeal of the converted, but he does talk about how he takes issue with the fact that American school children are kind of given a foundation myth version of the American War of Independence, and he doesn't like the fact that that introduces historical inaccuracies, which he feels are then played out or portrayed in The Patriot. So that also adds a little bit of context to where Brandon F. is coming from regarding this movie.
Of course, you can find a link to that video down in the description below. This reality of slavery is not how The Patriot portrays it. Rather, it portrays the institution of slavery as, at best, a benign one. Perhaps even, in its worst examples, an idyllic situation. Now, to see the clearest example of this, really we need look no further than the happy little farm of our main character, Mr. Benjamin Martin. One of our first scenes in the film is that of laborers in Martin's fields. They're doing simple work, with calming music in the background as children are running throughout the fields. One woman, on first impressions a house slave of sorts, is preparing a meal, and later on she leaves the home with a bright smile, wholesome smile to Martin's children as she accepts the mail from its white carrier. Now, let's look at this interaction between the two of them.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, she says to him simply, to which the man responds, "You're welcome," as one would to an equal. It's a little strange, but maybe we're just looking for conflict where none really is meant to exist. It's all a bit convenient, a little bit too happy, we might say, but then nothing so extraordinarily out of place either. After all, this is not a film about the horrors of slavery, so naturally that's not going to be the main focus. And as this woman is a house slave, she will be treated better than many of the field workers, and it's very possible that she has a good relationship with this particular mail carrier. So again, nothing particularly wrong there.
And of course, we'll find out a little bit more about the reality of this situation as we go on here. But he does make some good points about the different situations that slaves would be in, based on the context of where they were being used. And it's unfortunate, again, that we have to talk about being used, but that's obviously what the case was when it comes to slavery.
But you see, throughout these first few scenes, we start seeing more and more of these little conveniences. Here, for example, when the children enthusiastically approach their father to tell him some news, he asks them,
"Did you finish planting the south field?"
telling us that Martin is having his children work around the farm, the sort of mundane labor, planting, that's usually reserved for, well, slaves. Hardly a masculine art, as a landed member of the southern gentry would have his boys, well, being raised with. Indeed, sometime later on, we see this very thing confirmed, as not only is this boy doing the work of a slave, but he's actually working right alongside them in the dirt.
And of course, later we do find out, spoiler alert, I guess, but obviously Brandon will talk about this later on, that what appears to be slaves here are actually freedmen. But, I do think that even if they were actually slaves in the movie, that, why wouldn't it be then upstanding that the plantation owner, the landowner here, was having his kids, learn hard labor anyway? It may be unrealistic, but I'm not necessarily sure that even if they were slaves, why having his kids do that hard labor would be a bad thing. Although, again, I do agree. I understand where Brandon is coming from, that it would make it sort of an unrealistic portrayal.
Two slaves don't really pay him much mind, though others do smile and laugh wholesomely at the contented innocence of the younger children as they are running after a horse. The house slave is very stern, in an almost maternal sense, as she orders one of the girls to bring them back to the house. Again, nothing necessarily too bad for a story in which the slave-master relationship is not the primary story being told, but still, it's kind of enough to make you wonder at the intentions of the author. Again, it all just seems a little bit too idyllic, doesn't it?
Well, and again, and one more point on that, again, I do agree with Brandon that, okay, if they were slaves and he was having them do that, it would be somewhat unrealistic, but I also think it would be difficult to have the protagonist in a modern film. And I get that, introducing modern sensibilities into history is not necessarily a good thing, but it would be difficult to relate to the protagonist, if he was the stereotypical, I should say, brutal slaveholder, that would teach his kids those same, unrelatable values. And again, I think that having your protagonist portrayed as being on the brutal end of the spectrum doesn't necessarily make for a relatable protagonist.
But again, maybe I'm just over-exaggerating things, and maybe I'm overthinking it all. But the first time that I really firmly realized that no, in fact, I was not, was when I saw this. And not only do we see the master himself working alongside his slave, but we also see him at the rear of his oxen working hard at the plow.
Okay, so again, you're taking something where, okay, he's teaching his kids a lesson, and now you're extending it a step further by portraying the actual landowner as doing this manual labor. But remember, at the time period, there were farms that only had 2 or 3 slaves. And again, these workers turn out to not be slaves, but even if they are, there were certainly situations where, there were one or two within the fold of a plantation where the landowner himself and presumably the rest of his family would have to work as well. So these things are not necessarily quite as unbelievable as Brandon would portray. But again, I do understand where he's coming from in that it's painting a best case scenario.
The master's shirt sleeves are rolled up. He's sweating profusely. His face and clothes are dirtied. This man is clearly performing physically taxing, back-breaking, hard labor on the farm. Meanwhile, look just ahead and we see a black man in the infinitely easier position of leading the oxen. Not only is Martin doing the harder work, but he is sacrificing himself to allow the slave to perform the less onerous task. As we see throughout the scene, there is hardly a lack of strong young slaves who are able to perform this task, but instead here we have Benjamin Martin, a man likely to be in his late 40s or 50s, the master of the estate, honestly toiling away to work his own land. Throughout the film, this is also the only real portrayal I've found of hard labor being done on a farm, and here it is being performed by the master of the farm. Now that, I think...
But again, that turns out to not be true once you find out that these are indeed freedmen. But again, everything we've been talking about here has been sort of an as if they were slaves. But in this case, it turns out that they actually were not. So, Brandon obviously does not go back and reanalyze these scenes under that context. But important to note that when he says, okay, the master is doing this, well, as it turns out, that's not actually the case, which I'm sure he'll get to in a minute here.
Is a bit more than just convenient. It is a blatant disregard for the very nature of the power dynamic between master and slave. Sure, there may have been instances here and there where something like this happened, but if it ever did, it would be by far the exception, never the rule. And you take that in conjunction with everything else we've discussed so far, and everything that we will be discussing, it gets even more intense than this. It seems like this movie is really trying its hardest to portray black slaves in the American South as being more or less on equal footing to the white population and even their so-called masters. Indeed, it would almost make you think that these people weren't meant to represent slaves at all. I mean, there's no other way to try and explain how immensely perfect, idyllic, and egalitarian these portrayals have been in the very beginning of the movie. But heavens above it, that would be ridiculous. I mean, even for a Mel Gibson movie, that would be ridiculous. I mean, heavens, could you imagine if they try to make it to where their main character, who was inspired by a really big-time slaveholder, historically speaking, as if you were the only major landowner in the American South to not have slaves working for?
Well, again, it's not so ridiculous that these would-be freedmen. It was certainly not common, as to Brandon's point. But again, the slaveholder he's referencing is a figure named Francis Marion, who supposedly the Benjamin Martin character was largely based on, but could just have easily been based on a guy named Isaac Ross, who we did a video about over on the Wayback History channel, not to do too much self-promotion, but he was a guy from South Carolina in this time period, just as Francis Marion was in real life, just as Benjamin Martin was in the movie, and employed a mix of both freedmen and slaves, later freed the remainder of his slaves, and was one of the founders of Liberia. But the point being that in the time of the American War of Independence, there certainly were large landholders that employed large numbers of freedmen at the time. So, although maybe uncommon, it's not so ridiculous, and yes, I would agree that it is to make it more relatable, but it's not something that didn't happen at all, ever, because in certain circumstances it did.
just to try and desperately make him out to be more relatable, seem like a better man to the modern audiences, with zero attention paid to the context of how that morality was actually conceived of during the time period. I mean, whew, goodness Lord, that would just be ridiculous. I mean, I like to think people would see right through that. It would be horrible, horrible writing. I can't imagine that they would ever...
Sir, we're not slaves. We work this land. Freedmen.
There we have...
Again, it is convenient, but it's not something that never happened. Again, the Benjamin Martin character could just as easily have been based off of, again, Isaac Ross rather than Francis Marion, and that would make it historically accurate. But I think he talks a little bit more about this.
Of course they did. Subtlety, it would seem, is an art wholly lost in this trash propaganda film. With that line, and indeed their portrayal of this happy and contented little estate, where everyone does their fair share, the authors of this script are actively spitting in the face of any person descended from these slave populations. Let's take a moment, if we will, to step away.
That seems a little bit dramatic.
From the film, and look at the actual history which supposedly inspired it. Benjamin Martin, as a character, is not so discreetly inspired by Francis Marion. He's a prominent soldier in the Continental Army and the American militia forces, but we'll compare Martin more closely with Marion in future content. Suffice to say for now that Marion, as a wealthy landowner in South Carolina, did not work his estate alongside freedmen, but in reality...
But again, all of that same qualifications in terms of fighting with the Continental Army in the War of Independence, being a large landholder in South Carolina during that time, all of that does apply to Isaac Ross as well. So Benjamin Martin may have been loosely inspired by Francis Marion, but could just as easily have been based off of Isaac Ross. And so, again, there's a reason why they don't call the character Francis Marion. It's a fictional character, loosely based off of Mr. Marion, but again, for the same token, could just as easily have been based off of Ross. Certainly a more convenient character portrayed, to Brandon's point. But the fact that it seems to be inspired by Marion does not discount the realities of the situation at the time, where there were a lot of different situations that African Americans were working in, both as slaves and in a much more limited context, again, acknowledging Brandon's point that it is pretty convenient, as freedmen.
He owned probably around 200 slaves. During the course of the war, Marion's plantation was indeed burned down, and many of his slaves ended up escaping as a result. After the war, Marion did not come across any sorts of grand revelations, but instead he repurchased a slave population to rebuild his home. Indeed, throughout the conflict, and presumably before and after the conflict, Marion had a reputation of cruelty towards black people.
How about that picture of Marion? Looks kind of like the the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Does not certainly portray Marion as a friendly guy.
Particularly those who fled to the relative, and I do mean relative here, safety of British arms. On his Wikipedia page, so take it with a grain of salt, I admit, and it's cited as coming from Jeffrey Robert Young's Domesticating Slavery, the master class in Georgia and South Carolina from 1670 to 1837, it reads that, quote, Marion was also tasked with combating groups of freed slaves working or fighting alongside the British. He received an order from the governor of South Carolina to execute any blacks suspected of carrying provisions or gathering intelligence for the enemy agreeable to the laws of this state. Now, please understand that I am not necessarily saying that Francis Marion was an evil or a bad man. If you've seen my video titled, Can We Judge the Past?, you'll understand my position that I myself am unable to say whether Marion was a good man or a bad man.
And I do appreciate the nuance that he's referencing here. So that is important. But again, the Benjamin Martin character is not Francis Marion. It's Benjamin Martin, a fictional character.
However, I will say that indeed he did many bad things, as we just discussed. And even if you don't believe that they are bad things, even if you hold to a more...
And that is very important to note when you're talking about any historical figure. I saw him put a picture on the screen of Dwight D. Eisenhower, certainly one of those who I think you'd put more in the good category than the bad. But again, whenever you're talking about any historical figure or modern figure or really any person in general, pretty much in the history of humanity, you're talking about, the good with the bad, the yin and the yang. I mean, everybody has a mix of admirable and not so admirable qualities.
Shall we say, morally relativist position, well, these are still things which ought to be told that we might give due and proper respect to the overall historical narrative, both to those who suffered as a result of Marion's actions and even to Marion himself.
Not going to try to go back and pause right on that little flash, but I'm assuming he was referencing some other historical figure.
As to not lie about who he was on his own merits, in his own terms and understanding. Instead, though, what this film does is with a very broad stroke completely brush and gloss over all of those less than savory details. And instead, it seeks to portray Francis Marion, or, Benjamin Martin, as a man...
Again, he kind of lends an air of ridiculousness to that, but there's a reason why they do not call the character Francis Marion.
Devoid of such things, which...
Because again, it could just as easily have been, numerous other figures. I would, again, agree with Brandon that probably there's a much more large selection of Francis Marion types in the American South at the time, or the British colonial South at the time, rather than Isaac Ross type figures. But again, there is a reason why they don't call the character Francis Marion. It's a fictional character.
Would today be deemed controversial. He is being shown as the sort of figure that modern Americans, modern-day 21st century audiences might gather around and look and say, well, look at that. You see, slavery wasn't really all that bad, was it?
So I agree with the first part of what he said there, in terms of that, yes, and as we said before, this probably was all done, and it is, fairly convenient that they did some of this stuff, but it's not totally unrealistic. I would disagree with the second part, that the reason that they're making it more relatable is to make modern audiences, or whether it was intentional or not, that it does have the effect of making modern audiences say that slavery wasn't so bad. Because, I don't think anybody with any common sense would ever say that.
And there we come to it. That is the entire point. At every turn, we shall see what this film is doing is telling us, actively telling us, that the condition of Black Americans during this period, on the whole, wasn't actually that bad. Not as bad as we traditionally understand it.
But is it, though? I mean, again, this film is not about that subject. This is sort of an ancillary subject to the film that Brandon, to his credit, is choosing to focus, a large amount of time on here. And it certainly deserves that kind of attention. But at the same time, that's not what the movie is about. So making the movie about that would have made it a different movie than the one it was. It's sort of an ancillary background subject to the movie. And is not, and had it been portrayed differently, would have likely changed the entire focus of what the movie was about. So I don't think necessarily the fact that they're glossing over it is a statement of, intention to portray slavery or race relations in the late 18th century in any certain way. They're acknowledging that, yes, this is a movie about the American War of Independence from the Southern perspective, but at the same time, yes, in a sort of convenient way, making it ancillary to the story, because it's not the main story of this film.
that really relations between the white and black populations were quite gentle and respectful, and that they were collectively together united in a greater struggle against the real enemy, those evil British. Here it is, of course, noteworthy that the film manages to take something overall positive, being the British policy of offering freedom to any slave who joined their ranks, and instead it even transforms it into the regular soldiers kidnapping this supposedly free population before forcibly pressing the men into their ranks. Now, admittedly, we've only covered one portrayal of race relations within this film so far, and that's not enough to make such an argument. In order to properly prove this point, we need to look much further than just the main character's situation. After all, it is often the case in film, for better or worse, that main characters are exceptional, that they tend to exude modern values in the face of their historical context, again, for better or worse. In this case, I dare say for worse. So let's go through the other portrayals of both slavery and the status of Black Americans more broadly within this film. And we'll start with the plantation.
All right, I think we're going to stop there for now because we've already done a lot of talking, but we'll pick up from there. So this one may be divided into 3 or 4 parts. I mean, there's a lot here to talk about. And again, big credit to Brandon F. for providing this platform to talk about a subject that really isn't talked about enough, which is race relations and slavery in colonial America, in late 18th century America, and in the world in general. So big credit to him on that. And so we'll get to part 2 coming up in, I would anticipate, a few days. But thank you so much for watching. Again, check out the original content. Check out Brandon F's channel. He is a fantastic filmmaker, video creator, all of the above. So definitely he deserves your views. Thank you so much for watching and for hitching on with our new project here on the Wayback History Reaction channel. For now, I'm Alex. I am out.